Tonight, world leaders gather to mark the D-Day 80th anniversary as they draw parallels with the war in Ukraine and conflict returning to Europe. Rishi Sunak tells veterans, "We owe you everything," while Keir Starmer pays tribute to their individual courage and collective strength. Well, Emmanuel Macron speaks of the courage of veterans in the war in Ukraine. Let us have their courage, he says. And President Biden says the US and its allies will not bow down and will stand for freedom. Also tonight, new records show the Conservative Party accepted a £150,000 donation from Frank Hester 2 days after Rishi Sunak condemned comments he reportedly made about Diane Abbott as racist and wrong. Our deputy political editor has been looking through the latest batch of political donation records and will be taking us through them. And as the parties put the finishing touches to their manifestos, we'll ask, how important are they really? Well, one promise that we will be keeping tonight, Jacqui Smith and Charlie Rowley will be with us for the next hour. It's Thursday, I'm Sophy Rodge live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Well, the election campaign has sparked into life over the last few days, but today politicians pressed pause for a moment as leaders from around the world gathered in Normandy to mark the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Tributes were paid to the sacrifices of those sometimes known as the greatest generation who fought to free Europe from the tyranny of Nazi rule. The veterans who made the journey were honoured, but of course their dwindling numbers were a reminder of just how important it is to keep telling their stories as they pass with glory into history. But even as the threats of the past were remembered, the shadow of future conflict hung over proceedings. Vladimir Putin, no longer invited to such events. The US president addressing the crowds, warning that democracy is more at risk now than at any point since the end of that war. And of course, that warning from Joe Biden echoes the one that was made by Rishi Sunak when he called the election of the perils of an unsafe world. So in the end, even an event on the beaches of northern France, as far away from the hurly-burly of election politics as you can imagine, became a reminder that history carries lessons for the political class of today about the fragility of peace and the terrible cost of war. Well, lots, of course, to discuss on the programme tonight, reflecting, of course, on those D-Day sacrifices and the challenges today of how to, I guess, maybe would say, in our politics today, to prepare the UK for a pre-war world. Well, let's bring in our duo for this evening, shall we? The former Labour Home Secretary, Jacqui Smith, and the former Conservative Special Advisor, Charlie Rowley. Great to have you both on the programme. I guess it's worth, isn't it, just kind of reflecting on D-Day for a moment before talking about the challenges of the world ahead. It's always such a kind of poignant event, isn't it? I mean, Jacqui, I know you probably remember it from the time when you were in office.
So I was just reflecting this morning, actually, that I could remember a family holiday in Normandy where we visited the beaches and I was with my kids, 2 boys, and I sort of looked at them and thought there were mothers that sent essentially their sons, some of them to die on these beaches in order to protect our freedoms. And you know, for me personally, that felt very poignant. Today we've had, and over the last few days actually, I found it intensely moving to hear from the veterans who are still alive, of course, in their late 90s, people who at the moment are able themselves to describe firsthand what happened, but of course are also providing us with what we need to be able to pass down to others about the sacrifice that was made in order, as I say, to protect those things that are so important to us.
It's true as well, we talk about the sacrifice made by the people who went to fight, but actually you're very right, the sacrifices are also very much made by the people who let their loved ones go. I mean, that in some ways is such a sacrifice too, isn't it, to reflect on.
Definitely, and some of the stories that people have been talking about, and listening to some of those veterans' accounts, and they're talking about it. Some of them, I think, for the first time, they were saying, because it is just too much. And after 80 years, now going to what's been a brilliant ceremony, a brilliant time of reflection, bringing a new generation, young people into the mix. I think the scenes and the stories have just been incredibly moving, and it defines what you were just saying at the top there, Sophie. We're in an election period here where we're talking about who we want to, to serve us. Well, these people have been given, been the absolute embodiment of what it is to serve their country. So we will thank them and pay tribute to them and their families.
We'll be talking a lot more on the programme about, the safety of the world and, defence, what it means to be British, all that kind of stuff later. So thank you very much. But first, I am pleased to say that we are joined now by the Veterans Minister, Johnny Mercer, who joins us from Plymouth. Thank you so much for being with us. We've just been talking about D-Day. What have you been reflecting on today?
Oh, well, I think when today comes around, it's always the veterans themselves and what it must have felt like. And it just kind of, when you see them, it just kind of blows your mind, the scale of the sacrifice, the endeavour, and what they did. And they literally just gave their today for our tomorrow. I mean, they knew they were doing that and they gave their today for our tomorrow. And when I see them, and I've been in Plymouth with D-Day veterans today, just an enormous sense of gratitude and real kind of, it's funny because for my generation, people who served and fought in, remote wars that were very different, we sort of tried to emulate their sense of duty and their sacrifice, and obviously never really came close, but they were such an inspiration for us. So to spend time with them is a real privilege.
Yeah, I can completely imagine that, actually. It must be particularly poignant if you're someone who has served in the armed forces as well. We're talking about the sacrifices that people made to help keep the UK, I guess, relatively safe for half a century almost. It has felt quite safe, as a civilian at times. But, of course, what some of the leaders were talking about were that we are in a quite a dangerous place at the minute, a kind of perilous place at the minute on the world stage. Do you think, I guess, we need to be slightly kind of shaken out of our complacency?
Oh, I think we can become dangerously complacent. And, this is what has kind of really driven my work on veterans, because certainly for a generation of some of us, these wars aren't actually remote, for military families and service families up and down the country during those Afghanistan years, you were expecting your door to be knocked out or the phone to go, and that to be your life completely changed, to you lose your mum or your dad or your only son or daughter. And I think that kind of complacency that it's almost the kind of amnesia that the nation sometimes wants to sink into about what's required to defend the extraordinary privileges and freedoms that we have. And, some of us work really hard. I think we feel very lucky to come home from these conflicts, and we feel this duty to make sure that people really understand and truly understand what it feels like to be a veteran in the United Kingdom today.
Of course, one of the key Conservative policies in this election campaign is the introduction of national service. And I know that you've spoken about how you think it would be, good to instil that sense of duty in people in the United Kingdom. I was just talking to Jacqui Smith, who's on our panel tonight, who said that she spoke to you at a podcast event just before the election was called, where an audience member asked you about the idea of national service. And you said that you didn't think it would actually help the army, because the army is in a different place right now, and so it's not something that the army actually needs. Is that your view?
So look, I mean, we were conflating there two different issues. So I was very clearly asked about national service in the 50s and 60s, and should we bring back that national service? And what's being talked about now is a kind of voluntary service with a pathway through for a very small number of people who want to do it. So there's no compulsion to it. And I think those two things are very different. And I think that difference is good. I still don't think, national service 50s or 60s style is particularly something we want to see, but anything that kind of really binds communities together and gives young people that sense of purpose and that sense of mission that I certainly felt, with a possibility to go into the military if you want to, right? So there's no compulsion to it, I think, is great. And I think, particularly in communities like mine, I think that it really matters, and it increases opportunities for young people.
I can see, the argument that you're making that it would help the young people, but would it help the army itself? I mean, they've got to work out what to do with all these people, haven't they? How to train them, what kind of role to find, particularly if they're only going to be in it for a short period of time.
Yeah, I mean, well, when the announcement came out, I think, people like myself and Ben Wallace and others worked hard to try and understand where the money was coming from, because I think, there is a real pressure in the military at the moment around the number of asks they are required to do. And people like me will always ask for more money for the military. So this is backed up by new money that can go into, I go visiting my cadets down here and things like that. And I would love them to have more resource and more opportunity and things like that. And this is backed by new money. So in that respect, I was pleased to see it. I think it should be given a fair wind. Is it perfect? Of course it's not, but it's an election, right? And at least it's a bold promise that defines between two parties that are often accused of basically being the same thing.
Another thing you've been pushing for is this idea of veterans' ID cards being allowed to be used as ID at an election, and I think that's now going to happen. Can I just ask though, why is it that veterans are allowed to use their ID to vote but students aren't? Is it because veterans are more likely to vote Conservative than students?
No, of course it's not. I think I've always been up against this argument. Why should veterans have dedicated mental health care pathways? Why should they have why should they have the military covenant? I think being in the military is a definitively
that's absolutely not. I'm talking about a very specific thing about why veterans' ID is able to be used as ID in polling stations and students isn't.
Yeah, because I can't comment on the students' part of it, but what we've had to do really a lot of work on is this digital verification in the veteran space to make sure that these cards can't be reproduced, to make sure that the digital records reflect a veteran service, and therefore we can use them. I don't think I've seen these stories about the idea that all veterans vote Conservative. They absolutely don't, and I've met many of them who who are not particularly happy. So I see the kind of media spin on it, but I mean, I'm not into that stuff. I think people know me by now. I'm not into that stuff. I'm interested in making sure that veterans are treated properly and that they can use their ID cards for all the things that we want them to.
Now, you're always a bit of a straight talker, so I'm quite interested to see how you'll respond to this question about, I guess, the direction of the Conservative Party. We're going to be talking to Andrew Street a bit later in the programme, who, for many people, see, is the kind of centrist, face of centrist conservatism, if you like. At the same time, it's very clear that Nigel Farage and Reform are rising in the polls more recently as well. Where do you think the Conservative Party should be? Should you be focusing on, the kind of right-wing flank with Nigel Farage, or worrying more about losing votes, I guess, in the blue wall to parties like the Liberal Democrats? What's your assessment?
Look, I think in all these things, there's no point looking at what everyone else is doing. You've got to think about what you believe in and why you get out of bed every morning to go and represent people in public service, and why you do what you do and what you believe in, right? And I'm a Conservative cabinet minister. I'm very proud of that. I believe in a modern, compassionate conservatism that we've seen under this Prime Minister. I think Reform, you cannot escape the truth that if you vote Reform, you will get a Labour government. So if those things that you believe in or claim to believe in that lead you to thinking about Reform, if you actually want to see them propagated in government policy rather than just being a protest vote, if you vote for Reform, you will get a Labour Member of Parliament here in Plymouth, and you will get a Labour government. And people really need to understand that. That's all I'd say about Reform. Their policy platform and everything is up to them. I think we have a good policy platform. I think you've seen some very good things announced. What we were talking today around veterans, we're talking about enshrining veterans' rights in this country for the first time in our history. That is a big moment, right? And there is a difference there between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. And that's the sort of thing we want to focus on. What do we actually believe in? Why do we do what we do? The legacy bill. Why do we not think it's right to prosecute veterans when they're 85 for something that's been investigated 6 times already, and treat them in the manner they were in Northern Ireland? Because we believe that it's not the right thing to do. It's about what you believe in. And I think you've got a difference there between the two parties, and we should focus on that.
We've talked a lot about some very important things in this interview, so you'll forgive me for asking you at the end about something that is a lot less important. But about a month ago, you were pictured with your shoes and socks off on a train. It sparked a bit of a kind of social media reaction, shall we say. So it's your chance to put your case for the defence. What was going on there?
So what had happened was, Sophie, I had taken my bike across Dartmoor to Exeter station because I like to do exercise because it helps me stop going crazy in this job. And unfortunately, the weather had changed up on the moor and I got absolutely drenched. So by the time I got to the bike, I was starting to get a bit sort of hypothermic by the time I got to the train. And I had to take my wet kit off and basically try and I couldn't dry it, but just try and get through the train journey. I honestly, I've been educated as to the social faux pas of taking off your shoes, and obviously I'm extremely sorry to everybody who was offended by my meat flippers. But I think worse crimes have been committed, and we should leave my tender meat flippers alone.
Okay, it's not where I thought this interview was going to go, talking about the tender meat flippers, but thank you very much
We'll
indeed
talk about
for
them
the
some
programme
more
today. Thank you. There you go, Johnny Mercer. Right, let's bring in Jacqui and Charlie, shall we? I'm not sure where to go after that, to be honest. It's a bit of a handbrake turn.
Well, you'll be pleased to know we've all got our shoes and socks
We
on.
have.
Your viewers will be delighted.
Yeah, exactly. All shoes and socks on in the studio. No antisocial behaviour going on tonight, I'm pleased to say. What did you, Charlie, what did you make about what he was saying about reform? It's something that I think we'll be talking a bit more about the programme as well.
Well, I think that ultimately Johnny's right. You know, if you do vote for reform in one of those split constituencies, you are going to end up probably with a Labour member of Parliament. So if you want to stop that, then the only option really is to vote Conservative. But there is obviously a lot of a concern about the polling. I think about reform catching up the Conservatives. But I think you've just got to ask people, you know, the real question about who can actually deliver. And I think that, you know, for whatever the faults of Rishi Sunak or the Rwanda policy, whatever your views on it, the government said it's going to do it, so it has to deliver it. And I think, you know, Rishi Sunak, to his credit, he's gone further than any other Prime Minister or Home Secretary to tackle the issue of illegal immigration or immigration more broadly. And that is something that clearly communities up and down the country are grappling with. So if you vote for reform, yes, you might have someone for years and years has talked tough on it. That's Nigel Farage. But he hasn't been able to deliver on it. He won't be able to deliver it in Parliament. What that will do is leave you with a Labour government that wants to scrap Rwanda and doesn't really have a plan like Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives.
I mean, I guess some would say that some on the left would like to see Labour differentiating more when it comes to immigration, rather than, I guess, agreeing with some of the Conservative diagnosis that levels are too high and that they need to come down.
Well, I think there's two things here. First of all, I don't think Reform are catching up the Tories so effectively only because they're talking about immigration. You know, obviously that's a key part of their platform, but Nigel Farage has also been talking about the way that, everything feels broken in the country. That's the sort of attraction that he also has to voters. But I think, almost exactly the opposite thing has happened in the Labour Party to what's happening in the Tory Party. Keir Starmer has worked enormously hard to bring the Labour Party back to what I would consider to be the sensible centre-left, put it in the service of the British people as he describes it. That's where you win elections from in this country. And, frankly, if the Tories want to go off, as they were doing even before Nigel Farage said that he wanted to now lead reform, if the Tories want to drift off to the far right, well, as far as I'm concerned, that's fine, because I don't think that's the place where you win elections from, and certainly not the place that you govern a country like Britain from.
Is that a risk? I mean, there is a genuine debate here, isn't there, about, if the Conservatives focusing on, I guess, the red wall, people who maybe voted for Boris Johnson for the first time last time, and they're alienating the blue wall.
Well, there is risk, yes. You can't assume that everyone that is going to vote reform or why they're doing so well in the polls is because they would be traditional Conservative voters. There will be people that have voted Labour that feel that immigration is just a number one issue for them, and the Reform Party are articulating it better than either of the two main parties. So you can't just make that assumption. But I do think it's just worth reminding people that, look, what the Conservatives are offering is something that is quite tough on immigration. But what I think they need to do is to hold on to, as Jacqui was saying, that centre ground. There has to be more policies that are coming forward, not just about national service, not just about tax cuts, not just about immigration. There has to be hope and optimism and other things such as housing, such as social care, such as childcare, policies that I'm sure we're going to hear in the next few weeks before polling day. We're
going to be hearing from Luke Pollard, seen for the Labour Party as well. How do you think Labour's doing when it comes to defence, Jacqui?
Oh, I think very well. There was some polling just before the election, I think that possibly the last time or time before last I was on here, which suggested that actually Labour had got a lead on the issue of defence, which has been pretty unusual in the history of the Labour Party. So seeing Keir Starmer this week or a few days ago standing in front of the at least 14 Labour candidates who are now former veterans. So actually, you know, Johnny is right, not all veterans are voting Tory by any means, and talking about his commitment, in that case, to our nuclear deterrent, I think shows that Labour are well and truly on the ground where they need to be with respect to defence.
OK, well, let's get a bit more, shall we, on Labour and defence, and of course on those D-Day commemorations as well, because we can talk now to Luke Pollard, who is the Shadow Armed Forces Minister. We've been talking about D-Day today, of course. What in particular have you been reflecting on today?
Well, in the service that I attended earlier on today, I reflected on how few D-Day veterans there still are, and why it's really important now that in marking this really important part of our calendar, we renew our effort to tell the story about the service and the sacrifice that that generation made, not just in storming the beaches and parachuting behind enemy lines, but in the whole Second World War effort of people. Because young people these days regard this as something quite far in the past. And indeed, 80 years ago is a long time ago. But that critical moment when Western nations, Allied nations, took on Nazi Germany, invaded and stormed those beaches in Normandy is such an important part of our national story, an important part for the echoes of history that we're facing today with threats to not only our allies, such as Ukraine, but also to the UK as well.
You're talking there about the sacrifice that people made, and also that for many young people it feels like an awful long time ago. Do you agree with the analysis that some have made of the situation, that we're in a more dangerous time now than at any time, perhaps since that war, and that we've actually entered, I guess, a pre-war period, as the Defence Secretary has said?
I do. Our allies and ourselves are facing more difficult and contested times. It's not only the threat, the immediate threat that Russia is posing to our friends in Ukraine, but also the threats they're making to NATO nations in Eastern Europe, but also to the threats to the UK homeland as well. And in these more difficult times, it's important that we have a clear plan for defence. That's why Labour is proposing that we increase defence spending to 2.5%, that we invest more in British companies rather than sending contracts for military equipment to foreign countries, and that we're making sure we're renewing the contract between those who serve our country and the nation. Because with falling morale in each of our armed services and a frankly awful state of military accommodation with leaky roofs, broken boilers and black mould in bedrooms, we can see why the retention challenge in our armed forces is so difficult. But we need more people in our armed forces to see a career in military service, not only to protect ourselves, but to protect our allies. That's why Labour set out our ambition that on day one of a Labour government, we'll have a defence and security review that will look at the threats that we're facing, but also what's needed to deter those threats and, if necessary, defeat them.
OK, so one of the things that I know that the Labour Party has been quite critical on is what's happened to the army and the size of the army, specifically under the Conservatives. Keir Starmer saying the Conservatives have cut the army to the smallest size since Napoleon. John Healey saying that they've hollowed out the army. So would a Labour government make the army bigger?
Well, it's not just Labour that's saying that the armed forces have been hollowed out. Ben Wallace said in the House of Commons that they've hollowed out.
So would Labour make it bigger then? Would Labour make the army bigger is the question?
Well, that's why we're having a defence review on day one of a Labour government, because there's certain information that you need to have to be able to make that decision. And in opposition, we don't get to see the classified briefings, the intelligence briefings, and the analysis from our allies that would be required to look at what is the shape of our armed forces. That's why we want that review on day one of a Labour government, reporting in the first year.
But you've said it's been hollowed out, haven't you? You've said it's been hollowed out, so you are making a judgment on it. I guess my other question is, you say you want to have a strategic defence review on day one. If that recommends increasing the size of the army, will you do it?
I mean, that's the reason why we're having this review. What we'll also set out in that review is a clear glide path as to how we get to 2.5%, and importantly, the sequence of what we spend that money on. Because we need to make sure that we're stemming the huge outflow of armed forces personnel who are leaving service at the moment, make sure we're investing in the right kit, especially purchasing that sometimes that complex high-end kit that we need with our allies, making sure that we're continuing the nuclear submarine presence in the North Atlantic that keeps us safe with a continuous at-sea deterrent, These are all difficult, expensive, but absolutely vital things that we need to do. That's why a proper defence review that looks at the sequence of that spend, the seriousness of the challenges we're facing, and how we need to shape our forces to make sure that they're able to respond to the challenges we're facing is so important. If I could fit it in a soundbite, I would. But the thing is, we need to have that serious review to make sure we're keeping our country safe.
I understand it's a complex issue and hard to fit into sound bites, but just forgive me because I'm not really clear. If the Strategic Defence Review recommends increasing the size of the army, will you then increase the size of the army?
I mean, we're having a defence review to right-size our military, and that's not just the army. That's also the Navy and the Air Force as well. I mean, each of the Navy and Air Force have roughly around 28,000 people at the moment.
I'm still not
the
really
Army's
clear. I'll be honest.
Around 73,000 for the first time. We need to make sure we not only have the right number of people, but the right kit and the right formation, the right posture to make sure we can deter and defeat any adversaries. And that's what that defence review is designed to achieve.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Luke Pollard, there, the Shadow Veterans Minister. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, back to the election campaign, because the latest donations data from the Electoral Commission were released today, right in the middle of that campaign, and it's reignited some controversy over a Conservative donor who was accused of saying that Labour's Diane Abbott should be shot. Our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, is here.
Elections are big money affairs, but who is building the biggest war chest and where does the cash come from? Today, that was answered by the donations watchdog, the Electoral Commission. And here it is. From January to the end of March, the Tories raised just over £8 million. Labour on 6.6 million, Lib Dems, well, they were much further behind on 1.5 million, and the Greens, well, you can see that, just over £250,000. And here is the list of the biggest Tory donors. So this man, Sir Peter Wood, well, he founded Direct Line. Richard Harpin, he lent his helicopter to Rishi Sunak. And top of the list, by a mile, giving £5 million this year, IT firm, the Phoenix Partnership, run by a businessman at the centre of a major storm earlier this year, Frank Hester. Now, Hester is the largest ever donor to the Tories. In March, it was reported that he made these remarks about the then Labour MP, Diane Abbott, back in 2019. He said, "You just want to hate all black women because she's there. I don't hate all black women at all, but I think she should be shot." Hester denied that the comments were connected with skin colour or gender, but the Tories faced calls to hand back his cash, and Rishi Sunak publicly condemned the remarks. So watch here.
What he said was wrong and racist. I've made that clear, and it's right that he's apologised for that, and where remorse is shown, I think that should be accepted.
Now watch. Rishi Sunak gave the interview that you just saw on March the 14th. But the very same day, it's emerged the party was accepting yet another £150,000 from Mr Hester's company. Today, Labour said that this showed Sunak has no integrity. But what of Labour? Here are the list of their biggest donors. A hedge fund manager, lots of unions, and at the top, Ecotricity, which is run by this man, Dale Vince. Now, we revealed that he was the founding funder of Just Stop Oil. Tories called on Labour to return his money, but you can see here that the funds just keep rolling in. Another big Labour backer is Labour Together. That's a Starmerite think tank. Big money paying for staff who were seconded to the shadow cabinet. Run by this man, who it just so happens was last week selected for the plum Labour seat of Macclesfield in Greater Manchester, irritating the party's left. The Westminster Accounts Project traces how money works in our politics. At election time, that's more important than ever.
Sam Coates, our Deputy Political Editor there, talking us through the latest on those donations. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, why is the Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross's decision to swap seats for the upcoming election ruffled feathers? Find out next.
Westminster may seem far from Grimsby and Cleethorpes, but not for long. With a general election around the corner, we're bringing you Sunak versus Starmer, live from Grimsby. Putting their cases forward and facing questions from a live audience. Who will convince you to give them the keys to this place? The battle for number 10. Get the full story first on Sky News.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. A new start to Sunday.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
I'm Dan Whitehead and I'm Sky's West of England correspondent.
I'm Katie Spencer and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent. We help you to understand the world with us.
I'm Adam Parsons, I'm Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels. We take you to the heart of stories that shape our world.
I'm Lisa Dowd and I'm one of Sky's Midlands correspondents. The reason I do this job is because you never know where it's going to lead.
Hello, welcome back. You're watching the Politics Hub on Sky News, the top stories. Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer have paid tributes to the sacrifices of D-Day veterans as 80th anniversary commemorations are held in Normandy. The latest donation figures from the Electoral Commission reveal that the Conservatives received £5 million from Frank Hester, who was accused of saying he wanted Diane Abbott to be shot. Now you can stay up to date with all the goings-on in the election on our Digital Politics Hub by scanning the QR code at the bottom of your screen, among the other stories we've been covering that you can read about on our Digital Hub today. Details of a new YouGov poll which show Nigel Farage's Reform UK is gaining ground on the Conservatives with just a 2-point gap between the two parties. And after there was a bit of controversy over Richard Holden's selection, that's him there for a Conservative Party seat, our chief political correspondent John Craig has been looking at how the last-minute dash to fill seats compares to years gone by. So all that and much more, just scan the QR code on the bottom of your screen. Well, after a series of rows over the candidate selections, the final list of the people standing for the parties on July the 4th will be confirmed tomorrow. But not before one last controversy after the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Douglas Ross, decided to switch seats from his current Moray constituency to Aberdeenshire North and Moray East, which looks, on the face of it, to be a safer seat. Well, we can speak now to our Scotland correspondent, Conor Gillies. Conor, what's going on?
Sophie, this has become a right mess. It's been a day of drama here in Scotland. Douglas Ross being called a lot of names, including ruthless, shameless, and essentially sacking a man in his sickbed. There are a couple of issues at play here, and let's just talk them through. The first one is that this is a major U-turn from Douglas Ross. This is a man, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, who had 3 jobs. He's an MSP, he was an MP, and he's a football referee as well. And he said, look, I'm going to be stepping aside from my role as an MP, giving up that job and focusing my priorities on the situation here in Scotland. So there we have that first U-turn of the day. The second issue is that this new constituency of Aberdeenshire North and Moray East already had a candidate. There had already been a selection process, and that man in the seat there was David Duguid. Now, he has not been in great shape in terms of his health. He has been in hospital, in intensive care. However, he has said he was ready to fight in this election. He was ready to take the fight to the SNP in that part of the world, and he said that he would win the situation there. However, late last night, the Scottish Conservatives said that he would not be standing. He was being blocked from standing, and that has created this drama because Douglas Ross, in a dramatic moment in this election campaign, swooped in this morning and said this was his moment and that he would be standing in that seat, and David Duguid would have no room whatsoever for now. He would be welcome, he said, when he's back to full health, whenever that may be in the years ahead. Interestingly, though, Douglas Ross said that he has not had a single conversation with David Duguid. He didn't have the blessing of David Duguid's family, so I thought that was interesting. The other big issue here is the optics of how this looks. Is it essentially Douglas Ross stabbing a close colleague, a close ally in the back here when he is in his sickbed, when he is still in hospital? The SNP have said this is a low blow and it's straight out of the Nigel Farage playbook. But there are also some issues as well with Douglas Ross defending this. He is saying, look, it's the Scottish Conservative Management Board, essentially, that made this decision. Well, Douglas Ross sits on that board. Now, he said he wasn't part of this decision-making process. But just finally, if we take a step back in all of this too, the polls are not looking in great shape for the Scottish Conservatives. They're currently the main opposition here in Scotland. The polls are suggesting they could slip in to third. So is Douglas Ross looking at his future beyond his leadership in the Scottish Conservatives? Is he on manoeuvres to try and get back into Westminster, where he could be in more of a position with the UK Conservative Party? Either way, this has become a right mess, and the opposition are going to have a field day with this in the coming days.
Goodness me, what drama. Connor, thank you very much indeed. Connor Gillies there. And here's the full list of candidates who are standing in that seat, Aberdeenshire North and Moray East. The full list of candidates for that constituency on your screens right now. Coming up next on the Politics Hub. Take on Farage or seize the centre ground? How should the Conservatives fight this election campaign? I'll speak to the former West Midlands Mayor, Andy Street. welcome back. Well, an election campaign is not really the best time for soul searching, but it does seem to be the current mood of the Conservative Party, facing the threat of Reform UK overtaking them in opinion polls, at the same time as that poll from YouGov for Sky News suggested that swathes of Middle England could switch en masse to Labour. So what should they do? Well, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is clear, warning today that elections are won from the centre ground. So what does someone who is seen as one of the leading figures of centrist conservatism, the former West Midlands Mayor Andy Street, think? He joins us in the studio now. First, before we go to him, I did just want to play a clip of the interview that I did with him in the immediate aftermath of him losing the mayoralty earlier last month.
Disappointed is a soft word, but we'll go with it. Yeah, I am. But I'm also incredibly proud, actually, to lose by 1,500 in a region of millions. Given the situation the party finds itself in, and given that this has always been a place where some people said you should never have won in the first place, I'm actually very, very proud of what we've done. I'm proud of how we've built this brand of conservatism here, and I'm proud, most importantly of all, of how we've delivered for people across the West Midlands. But yeah, of course, hugely disappointed tonight.
You said that disappointed is a soft word. What word would you choose then?
I suppose personally devastated, but yeah, that's the right word.
Thanks for being with us. When we last spoke, it was just after that result had come in. And I think a lot of people had actually just found the exit door, actually, but you didn't. You kind of fronted it up. You spoke to people, you did the interviews, and it was clear how, as you put it, devastated you were by that result. How are you feeling about it now?
Don't change that description, actually. You can't put your life into doing a job like that, leading a region of 3 million people, and then just walk away and say that wasn't something significant. So that was the right word. Time heals, of course, and you begin to think about the future. But equally, I think the little clip you showed about how well we've done in that election, given the state of the Conservative Party, actually to come so close, there is a message about where the Conservative Party has to go in the future from what's happened in the West Midlands.
Yeah, you were clear, weren't you, in the message about, I guess, parties winning from the centre, and now you've had a bit more time to digest everything. Do you want to kind of expand on what you mean by that?
Well, it's interesting, that very phrase, Jeremy Hunt used it, Jacqui used it in the panel earlier on, and so there's a lot of wisdom coalescing around this view that if you look at, let's take what happened in the West Midlands and then we can perhaps extrapolate it out. But the type of Conservative leadership that I'd shown was an inclusive brand where we thought just as much about how the most successful people in society were going to get on, fulfill their dreams, as we thought about those who were not able perhaps to get on without some support from the public sector, how we thought about the different communities in all senses, different ethnic backgrounds, different attitudes, everything to bring a society together where everyone could thrive together. It wasn't pitching one against the other, it was a collective approach. And we very, very nearly won through for the third time against all the odds. So there is a lesson in that.
You see, I guess some people would listen to you and think, yeah, that sounds great, but look at where the Conservatives are now. You need to pursue a core vote strategy, getting your core vote out, and that means appealing to, for example, to pensioners, to the wealthy, people who traditionally vote Conservative. What would you say to that?
I would say that's a very unambitious strategy. If you look, let's go back really big picture, over 100 years, every time there's been a major change in Britain, someone has won from the middle ground. Whether we go right back to pre-war, when the sort of majorities that were there for Baldwin and Chamberlain, if you then go through to what happened immediately post-war, and of course Harold Macmillan, that was an incredible centrist approach. And even Margaret Thatcher in '79, she started off as a centrist, and of course the great Labour success with Tony Blair and David Cameron's response as well. Every time the big changes have been won from the middle. And if you go to a core vote strategy, you will cede that middle ground. And my message to my party in that they plan the next 4 weeks is do not cede that ground, because actually the real battle is with Labour and the Lib Dems over the middle ground. We're all obsessed with what Nigel Farage is doing at the moment, but that is just one flank. The real debate is in that centre.
But some people would say they're obsessing about Nigel Farage for a reason. I mean, a Sky News YouGov poll yesterday put Reform within 2 points of the Conservatives, and they're eating into really important seats for you.
Yeah, so why is that at the moment? Because Nigel Farage has had the whole week of the story has been about him. That will recede. I'm fairly confident of that. But we're arguing there about one flank, and we're leaving the other flank completely open if that's where we go.
So the blue wall, if you like.
The blue wall. Indeed,
you're ignoring.
Indeed, you could put it like that, but it's more than the blue wall, actually. It's this almost where the consensus is built in what is, after all, a very moderate society that we have built here, where there is a consensus in the centre, and that's what we have to own and not cede it.
We haven't had manifestos yet. You know, we're still, I guess, in the kind of early days, if you like, of the campaign. What's your assessment so far? Do you think this is a Conservative campaign that is being fought from the centre, honestly?
Well, let's just think about who some of the leading players in the government are, first of all. Jeremy Hunt, you couldn't find a more moderate man. David Cameron, you couldn't find his achievement, very clear, the centre ground. So remember, this government has got incredible heavyweights.
I'm asking about the campaign, though,
That's
right?
fair. And some of the new policy announcements that we've seen so far have definitely been, I'm not denying the point, to try to shore up the core vote. What I want to see in the next 4 weeks is us answer the question, where's the wealth of this country going to come from in the future? How are we all going to afford all the public services that are actually talked about? And to do that, you have to answer those questions about future. And as yet, we have not done that. Neither party has done that in the campaign.
I'm interested in that as well, because I guess I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet about, you know, it's such a challenge. Whoever wins after the next election, it's such a challenge. If you look at the state of the public finances, debt levels, if you look at the projected public service spending, if you look at the historic levels of taxation we're seeing, I guess if you describe yourself as an executive politician.
Yes.
You know, if you were running a business now, you'd be talking everyone through your plan, redundancies, explaining why you've got to make them or why you've got to put up prices.
Yes.
What do you think politicians of either party should be doing now to prepare the public?
It's a great analogy, because I would be talking, and I think it applies in politics as well, about hard choices. What are we actually going to prioritise? What are we going to spend our money on? How are we going to grow the amount of income that's going to come in to afford all of these pieces? And I think the public are saying, where are these choices? Where are the trade-offs? And actually, if I could, I would ask people to be overt about that, actually be brave. And I think there is a reward for the politician who is brave about that, actually.
What would you do then?
Well, the first thing I'd talk a hell of a lot more about is how is our country going to get back to a really good economic growth rate? How are we going to compete internationally? How is technology changing business? I mean, we've got some incredible successes in our technology sector. I haven't heard a huge amount about that. I haven't heard about how we're going to actually reform the health service based on technological changes as well. So people tend to see threat in change, but actually there is a wonderful opportunity in embracing that new technology. Let's hear about how that can answer some of these really deep-seated issues.
What about the hard choices, though? Doesn't sound like much of a hard choice, that one, then.
Well, you do have to decide which parts of the economy you are going to invest in. The whole idea of an industrial strategy, a business strategy, that we haven't heard a lot about that from either side, actually. So that is a hard choice, because you can't be all things to all men in economic development. You do have to put your chips down.
I want to talk a bit about you as well, because there were some people who thought you would, run for a seat, and you considered it, didn't you? Why did you decide against it?
Yeah, I did. Lots of people said, Andy, the logical thing to do is you've lost the mayoralty now, jump straight into a parliamentary career. And, it's very tempting. It would have been an easy answer. But actually, I said no, for one very simple reason. You said earlier on I was an executive politician. I've been an executive for 20 years, running a big business, and would say Britain's best business, actually. And you can't then go into a job that's not actually about executive leadership. It's an important job, being an MP, critical, everyone wants it. I get that, but it's a very different job. And it's a moment, to be honest, where I just stood back and thought, what am I going to be good at? And it's probably not that.
Do you have any more of an answer to that question, then? What it is, where you see yourself?
Well, I also said in that little statement I made about not doing it, that the thing I've really got the bug for over the last 7 years is this notion of public service. It can sound a bit old-fashioned, but actually at a time when politicians are perhaps not particularly trusted, there is something really, really pure about public service and actually doing the right thing for social improvement. And I've learned that you can make change if you bring all your sort of resources, skills together, and I hope that I can still contribute to the public policy debate and actually possibly leading a big institution for the UK.
Any hint on the institution?
No, not at all.
I knew it was a wasted question. I know you were only going to tell me what you're interviewing a lot, and there's no point pressing or stuff you're not willing to say.
I'm also going to have a good holiday and have a break over the summer. And also, it has to be said, support some of the people who've helped me as well. So
okay,
some
fair
of the
enough.
MPs.
Have you had any great hobbies you've had more time to do? Cooking, mountaineering,
getting fixed.
jigsaws?
Jigsaws. Well, hardly. I don't think I've got the temperament for that. I love the outdoors. So getting to Wales and up the mountains, that's been my thing.
Okay.
So great. Anyway,
great to have you on the programme. Thank you very much indeed. Andy Street there. Still to come on the Politics Hub. We'll be chatting with our duo about what they just heard from Andy Street. Plus, the parties have been trading blows over policy. Will the publication of their manifestos expected next week clear things up? And will they change anyone's vote? We'll discuss that next.
Coming up on the UK Tonight at 8, we are live at the National Memorial Arboretum, where there has been a special service to mark the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings, as world leaders pay tribute to those World War II heroes who fought so bravely on the beaches of Normandy. All that to come on the UK Tonight at 8.
We looked at participants who are from memory clinic, those who are at higher risk of developing dementia, and they also have concerns with memory and cognition. So we wanted to see if people who have something called as cognitive reserve, this build up by staying active mentally, physically, and had higher social interactions. So we realized that stress had a negative impact on spending time in leisure activities, or even has frequent attractions from social interactions. So we wanted to see that if these kinds of beneficial effects of cognitive reserve and cognition and Alzheimer's biomarkers had negative impact on stress, and if it varied by subjective and biological stress. And we sort of found that overall higher chronic stress appears to negate or undo the cognitive benefits we have by engaging in mentally stimulating activity and participating in enriching life activities, which might make people more susceptible to Alzheimer's. In research, we do have a lot of multi-domain interventions, like we focus on diet, physical activity, but we don't introduce like stress management practices like meditation or even mindfulness. It's a non-pharmacological intervention, so I think it could be interesting to see if involving those elements into our everyday life, not just memory clinic patients, increases our overall brain health per se.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Well, next week we're expecting to see the publication of the first of the party's manifestos, an opportunity for the policy wonks to get their teeth into the detail, but do they actually change anyone's minds? Well, we can bring back in Jacqui and Charlie to discuss that. Jacqui, I know that you could have had a bit of reflecting that you wanted to do about Andy Street though as well.
I did, because Andy and I did work together in the West Midlands, but as well as the West Midlands, the other thing we have in common is we know what it's like to lose in the full glare of publicity.
Brutal.
And enormously brutal. But for those candidates who fear they might be going to lose on the 4th of July, take a look at the speech that Andy Street made, you know, at that moment when you have to stand up in front of everybody. He was enormously dignified. He thanked his opponents. And that's the way that you need to lose, is in my view. So
good advice just before a general election, when we are expecting to see, I think it's fair to say, like quite a bit of churn on the seats as well. So a lot of people having to make that difficult speech up in the glare of publicity, as you say. How important are manifestos, do you think? Can they just change a race?
Maybe not on their own, but I think they are important because it allows the public to actually see in black and white in a document what it is that you're going to stand for, what it is that you're going to do if you get elected, and the achievements that you hope to achieve. So I think they do have some sway. How many people are actually going to sift through them, or you know, bedtime reading?
How many candidates are going to read them?
bedtime reading, perhaps for a lot of people to get off early. But
how about you two? Will you read both party manifestos? Do you think, or?
Oh, I won't
Confession time.
I won't put them down. Cover to cover.
You are an insomniac, Charlie, obviously.
What do you think, Jacqui? Do you think that manifestos can sometimes, you know, change a campaign?
I can't remember a time when they have, actually. You know, I mean, I think Charlie's absolutely right. You know, obviously, you need to have a document that sets out, to an extent, the priorities that you're going to have in government. I think the civil service will read them quite carefully, by the way, as they're putting together their sort of preparations for government. I suspect in the case of Labour's, which will be sort of finally approved tomorrow in what's called our Clause 5 moment, I think it will be reasonably safe.
Yeah.
So that won't be the turning point.
Well, the one thing I would say quickly is obviously I remember in 2017 where, you know, Theresa May was 20 points ahead in the polls and the manifestos came out to deal with social care, where the whole country sort of wasn't quite sure, wasn't quite ready for it. So if we see something similar in a Labour Party manifesto that is too bold, perhaps, and 20 points ahead in the polls, it could change everything.
Could go the wrong way rather than the right way. Thank you both very much indeed. That's it from us tonight. Politics Hub back tomorrow with Ali Fortescue. Up next, it's the UK Tonight.